Well, that took a lot of convincing. You had a, I think it was probably gone. Did you go to Cincinnati or New York?
I went to Cincinnati.
So was Ellis Rifkin retired already?
Yeah, yeah.
So when he lectured, he always brought up, in those days, he had these little dictaphones, and he always taped his own lectures. He said in case he said something that he wanted to use in a book. So he recorded his own stuff. It was kind of interesting.
That's great. Well, I'll
Yeah.
definitely hold on to this.
Yeah. How's the sound level?
Seems good to me.
Okay.
I can hear you loud and clear.
I'm, I'm looking to see if I have any function that, oops, I lost you.
Are you in gallery mode? That should help.
There, I'm back. Um, I'm just looking to see if I can increase the sound for me to hear on my own.
Oh,
I
okay.
don't see a I don't see a function. Video, audio. Audio. Well, it is what it is. I can hear enough. Just to go over, this is about an hour talk,
Hmm.
and we want to leave a nice amount of time for questions.
Great.
Um, I would take questions during. Shouldn't be a problem for me.
Okay.
But then I would like to have, kind of more open mic then too, if that's okay.
Sounds good to me.
Thank you.
The next year. We're the farmer for the eggs. And
Rabbi Sussman, I went to high school with Rabbi Rifkin's daughter, Sharon. I haven't heard their name in years.
Oh, okay. That's the small world department.
That's right. Yeah, she lived, well, the last I knew, she was living in California.
Hmm. Don't know.
Rabbi, since we're waiting, I've got a question for you.
Yeah, sure.
Um,
Okay. Is that
okay,
Mark?
yes.
Oh, wait, which rabbi? Rabbi
Well,
Sussman?
actually, what do you both rabbis, I guess, it would be the way. Since we're recording it, is it possible that we could put that in so that people could archive it in case they miss election?
Yeah, well, I think we could we could certainly look into that,
Yeah,
posting it on
post.
the site.
And I'll retain a copy myself too if anybody can't find it. Once Rabbi Molo shares it with me, that is.
You got it.
Russ,
Can't seem to find the right button. I'm not hearing it. It's too quiet.
All right. Norma, we are hearing you.
Oh, here I just found a sound thing for me. I'm able to increase the volume in my own computer. Good.
Oh, good. Okay.
Not me.
It was in a different place.
You'll forgive me, everybody. I'm just going through and muting everybody
Ah,
while we get set up here so that we can focus our full attention on Rabbi Sussman. Um, and Rabbi, if you'd like to get started, I'm sure we'll have folks trickling in here as we go, but I think this is a good start for us. So whenever you're,
Okay.
by all means.
Do you want to do any kind of introduction, or you may explain myself, or?
I'm always delighted to introduce you.
Well,
I could, let me see here.
you seem to know everything about me Friday nights, though. As
Well, I do have quite the introduction prepared for you, and we were so delighted to have you join us last Friday in conversation with Rabbi Newberg on the topic of anti-Semitism. How bad is it? And you certainly answered that question for us. It's not great. It's certainly not a great time for anti-Semitism in the world. God willing, it will be better at some point. But in the meantime, I do want to introduce you to the folks who may not have had the pleasure of knowing you just yet. So it is our great pleasure at Mainline Reform Temple to welcome Rabbi Lance Sussman. Rabbi Sussman is a distinguished historian and rabbi ordained at the Hebrew Union College. He earned his PhD in American Jewish history from HUC as well, and most recently served as the senior rabbi of Reform Congregation, Knesset Israel, in Elkins Park from 2001 to 2022. And he is now their rabbi emeritus. Beyond the Bema, Rabbi Sussman has had
I'm reserving some on it, so you can just do the bathroom. That's all right. Yeah.
Okay, make sure you're muted. Okay, there we go. Beyond the Bema, Rabbi Sussman has had a distinguished career in academia, teaching Jewish history at several esteemed institutions, including Princeton University, Rutgers, Temple University, Hunter College, and HUC in New York City. He's also served as chair of the Jewish Studies Department in Binghamton University and currently serves as the chair of the Board of Governors at Gratz College in Melrose Park. Rabbi,
I'm past chair.
what was that?
Past chair.
Oh, past
I'm
chair.
past chair of Gratz.
Immediate past chair, correct?
Immediate, yeah. Well, immediate, second immediate. It moves on. Life moves on.
Oh, okay. Rabbi Sussman also serves on the executive board of the Philadelphia Board of Rabbis. In addition to his leadership in teaching, Rabbi Sussman is a prolific author and historian. His latest work includes a compelling trilogy that offers an intimate and scholarly look into the evolving role of the Reform rabbi in America. There are three parts to the trilogy, of course. We have the portrait of an American rabbi in his own words. We have the portrait of a Reform rabbi, continuity and change, and the portrait of a rabbi historian, how did we get here? And that last volume was just published in January. So through
Correct.
these books, Rabbi Sussman explores the personal and professional journey of a Reform rabbi, weaving together memoir and history and analysis of the ever-changing Jewish landscape. So we are very excited to welcome you here today for part one of our journey with you as our scholar in residence here. And today we are discussing why sermons, rabbis as the Jewish narrators of our time. So we are delighted to welcome you, and please take it away.
Thank you, Rabbi, for that nice, complete introduction. The topic today can a part of this, actually a small part of it, can be found in what Rabbi referred to as my first volume. I don't know if it's in focus or not, but Portrait of an American Rabbi, page 457. I wrote an article there called "Why We Need Good Sermons," and what I plan to do with you today is to do a much expanded version of that, realizing that we have the time constraint of 1 hour. I want to say that I am willing to take questions and nice comments along the way, but we will kind of watch the clock so that at the end there can be open microphone if you want to send a question by chat. Yes, I have a chat function here. That would be another way to do it. there's an expression that when one teaches to learn. So I'm a strong believer in that, and I don't want to just do a frontal presentation. So without further ado, sermons grow out of a more ancient tradition in ancient Israel, which of course was the prophetic address. Judaism is a prophet-based religion. That is, we have people who connect with some transcendent voice. There's a lot of discussion about that, of course. There were non-literary prophets like Elijah who don't have their own book. And then beginning around the time of Amos and Hosea, by the beginning of the 8th century BCE, you begin to have collections of books, and those are usually referred to as the classical prophets. And so you have the prophetic oracle as the first form of public address in the long, very long, thousands of years long Jewish experience. Modern scholarship for the last 200 years, so it's really not that new, but particularly in the last 150 years, has challenged the authorship of the Torah and the way the Torah has been canonized over time. So if you read the Bible as literature in a linear fashion, Moses precedes the ancient prophets, but in modern biblical thought, the Torah is a later literary prophet, maybe or maybe not reflecting oral traditions, but it comes together around the year 400 BCE. Moses is the supreme prophet, and he gives a number of addresses, prophetic oracles, poetry, all types of public communication, which ultimately become foundational in Judaism. And I would distinguish between Israelite religion of the prophets and then the Judaism which comes after the destruction of the second temple. So you have the first pillar at that point by about the year 400 BC of what you need for a sermon. In order for there to be a sermon, you need a triangle, connected triangle of items. One, it would be text. The second would be congregation. And third would be the sermonic message. You have to have all three. And Judaism has a text, an agreed upon authoritative text by about the year 400 BCE, but it does not have a synagogue for quite a while. There's a vigorous debate, some in classical sources, which are mostly fanciful, that maybe the synagogue went back as far as the 700s BCE and was, quote, the Mikdash Me'at, the small sanctuary in the Temple of Jerusalem, but more likely the synagogue is an institution as we would recognize it today of the first or even second century of the Common Era, so that you would have an authority time, and you would have a congregation, because the Israel of the Judaism of the temple period does not have a congregation, so there's no need for sermons. In ancient Israel, well, there's a temple, whether it's the first temple or the second temple, and there was probably a Jewish temple down on the second cataract of the Nile. They built the temple there. It is a priestly religious institution in which sacrifice is the main activity. and there's no congregation to address. So in ancient Israel, the priests were not giving sermons. Sermons develop as a function of uh, the rise of the synagogue itself, well established by the second century, and a movement of people who had the authority and learning to interpret scripture. So it's scripture, congregation, and the person doing the talking. The earliest sermons were a mix of scriptural interpretation. By the time the synagogue develops, Hebrew was no longer the language of the Jewish people. Aramaic was. There are many branches to the language of Aramaic, as Rabbi Mullah well knows. And I can tell you definitively, the worst course, the hardest course I ever took in all of college, including rabbinic school, was a historical grammar of the Aramaic language, in which we compared different types of Aramaic. It would be like, I don't know, a French student taking an introduction to English literature and starting with Beowulf, then reading Shakespeare, and then reading E.E. Cummings. And we had to try to absorb all of these different systems of Aramaic. Aramaic was very widespread language throughout the ancient Near East, really during the time of the Roman Empire. The Western Empire spoke Latin, the Eastern Greek, and the Jews spoke either Greek or Aramaic, but not Latin so much. And once the Jews no longer were speaking Hebrew, the reading of Torah needed more explication. And the earliest version of that, as far as we know, were people called mitargamim, who were translators. So in lieu of chanting, which has its own history, there was a tradition of reading the Torah and then translating the Torah into Aramaic. And in fact, if you go into classical rabbinic literature, there are texts that will have the Hebrew Bible and then 2 to 3 Aramaic translations, like Targum Yonatan. For the word Targum means translation, and usually refers to, in the ancient world, as translation of scripture. For 2 years, I taught it at Rutgers up in New Brunswick, and the name of the student newspaper there is Targum. And nobody could explain to me how they ever got to that title. Maybe if there's any alum here, they could explain to me why they called it Targum. But it would make sense because it means, in a sense, the translator of our time and the commentator of our time. And that's a big part of what sermons were about. The sources for early sermons were discussions in the academy, much of which we call midrash, which is very usable because it's storytelling, which is good for the way sermons work. Agadah, which is legends of the rabbis, and then structured sermons themselves. Judaism, as you know, spawns sister religions or daughter religions, first in Christianity and then in Islam, and then they have the same structure of scripture, congregation, and sermon, and so they also have what we have. See, if you don't have that arrangement, let's say in Hinduism, where you have a temple, priests, private devotions, but not congregational worship, it's unlikely to have a sermonic message. So in that sense, it is derivative of scripture, and the idea of a solo scripture is actually a function of monotheism, that there's one God and one message from that God, or one central source. Where, let's say, in Hindu literature and the Vedas and all the different genres of Hindu literature, it's all over the place. There's lots of genres and lots of collections, so you don't have this single voice. But in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, you have all three, and in all three you have the sermonic tradition. The word sermon, I think, is derived from Old French and from, well, probably back originally to Latin, and the closest English synonym to it would be discourse. Over the centuries, we're now in the second century BCE, Christianity and Islam become much larger than Judaism. I would say, from a relative statistical point of view, Judaism is at its height around that first or second century in the context of the Roman Empire. Probably the greatest Jewish historian of modern times, Barone, at Columbia, estimated that Jews may have been as many as 10% of the Roman Empire, 5.5%. We don't know because there's no census material, and these are all just good guesses, reconstructed guesses. But the synagogue begins, the church begins, the mosque begins, and they all have sermons, and it becomes ritualized, and literally a piece of furniture develops in all three institutions, some platform where the word of God can be pronounced to the congregation. And I know in some Christian denominations, there's even outdoor altars that are attached to church buildings. The years I taught at Princeton, I was in the history department, and we looked on a courtyard, and on the other side was the church, the main church of the university, what they call the chapel, but it's really a cathedral. And it had a balcony, the pulpit, so that students could gather. It was, it started as a Presbyterian school, and students could gather on the outside, I guess on a night day, and the chaplain of the school could give a sermon that way. So there's a very long and rich history of sermons beginning in late antiquity in all three traditions. But something happens along the way in the Jewish tradition, and that is we are, at least orthodoxy, you would say orthodoxy today is a super highly liturgical tradition. There are prayers to be said by prescription of tradition at every minute of every day of the week and every week of the year. So, right now we're still in Shacharit morning, and Rabbi Molo would run a certain service that has a certain structure for this exact minute. And then if we decided to reconvene at 3 o'clock, and it would be the afternoon, you would have the Mincha service, which has some of the same components, but a different structure. So it would not include, let's say, the Shema and its blessings in the Mincha structure. But in any event, the Jewish tradition, particularly after the 9th century, I would say, when the prayer book becomes more standardized. If you look into the Talmud, in the first chapter of the first Seder, brachot, blessings, you can see that there was a lot of questions about the order of service, and it took a long time till the 10th century until the leading Iraqi Jewish um, scholar, rabbinic scholar Gaon Amram, wrote a letter to the new Jewish community of Spain in which he articulated the order of service in the prayer book. And once they had an agreed upon prayer book, the prayer book began to grow. There was tremendous liturgical creativity, something called a piyut, if you're familiar with that, which is a Jewish religious poem. We tend to have most of ours for just the high holidays, and services got longer and longer and longer. As you know, today an Orthodox prayer book can run a good 500 pages. A congregation can handle somewhere between 3 and 4 hours. And if you read 400 to 500 pages an hour, you have to go pretty quickly. So a style of worship develops in which everything is like an express train. And that already takes you to your maximum limit, so that the formal sermon of a rabbi on a regular basis on Shabbat in the Middle Ages begins to disappear from the synagogue, and sermons became more or less special occasions. There was also a tradition that still exists today of itinerant preaching, mostly on Saturday afternoons when there's a little more time between services. I remember in various trips to Israel, walking around ultra-Orthodox neighborhoods, and somebody might be talking about the portion of the week, and they were itinerant. There were also traveling preachers, itinerant preachers, the same way as you had in the American frontier among Protestants. You also had itinerant preachers in the Jewish community. There were expanded communal lessons, shiurim, in which the lecture itself was a sort of sermon. The classical sermon of the synagogue, and really this is global, follows a structure, and it has to do with an opening called a petichta in Aramaic. The verse itself, the text usually associated with either the text of the week or the holiday that you're nearby, a 3-point explication of the text, and then a closing, which always was positive, that used the Hebrew word nechemta, which in modern Hebrew would just say nachum, as in the name Menachem, words of consolation to end. Remember, much of Jewish history was somewhat sorrowful, and in any event, even if it wasn't a sorrowful moment, they viewed themselves as a community banished by God from their homeland and in need of comfort. So a definite structure begins to develop. So that's kind of the long background of the history of the sermon. If you're interested in the details and examples, is one scholar in particular today to go to. His name is Mark Saperstein. You may know his brother, David Saperstein, who was the social justice leader of the Reform movement for a couple of decades, really parallel to my own time in the pulpit. But his brother, Mark, is the supreme scholar of sermons. There were others before him, but in our own time, it was he's still alive, remarkably productive and comprehensive in his studies. And he also has anthologies. So if you want to look into any of this, then I would recommend Mark Saperstein, who has had mostly been he's American, but he's mostly been in the UK at Leo Beck College in London and Cambridge University. So there is some bibliography on this topic. When we get to the New World, um, sermons have already become a vital part of Christian culture. It's transplanted to our parts, um, and in many ways is the kind of the apex of the religious service itself. And we have great preachers um, among the Protestants, among the Pilgrims, very early on in the 17th century, like Jonathan Edwards, and their sermons are uh, collected and then published for and preserved for posterity. The Jewish community in America was very small, only 2,500 by the time of the Revolution. All of the original congregations were Sephardic and mostly made up of Portuguese Jews, and they did not have regular sermons. Um, the reason they didn't have regular sermons was that the service itself was already too long. Um, by the time of the Revolution, the tradition of special occasion sermons did develop. So if there was a governor's proclamation of a Thanksgiving Day or something like that, a sermon might be offered in the synagogue, but generally without a service, because you can't have both. Otherwise, you're there for 5 hours, and there's only one Yom Kippur a year. So they were on special occasions, and it needs to be remembered that until the 1840s, you have no rabbi living in North America. So that the early American sermons were done by learned laymen, like a Jacob de la Mata of South Carolina, who would then be invited to different synagogues across the country. The numbers begin to grow from the 5 during the Revolution. By the time of the Civil War, there's about 200 synagogues. Now I don't even know the number. It's in the thousands. There's about 850 or so Reform congregations alone, and many, many more Orthodox because they tend to be smaller units. The shift comes in about 1830 or so here in Philadelphia. Mikveh Israel, which was the original synagogue of Philadelphia, Sephardic, Portuguese synagogue, had a reader. You could even say Hazan, but it didn't even necessarily reach to the level of Hazan. And in 1829, 1830, they called to their pulpit a man by the name of Isaac Leeser, who was a German and who Sephardized himself and had written letters to the editor of various newspapers, usually defending the Jews against charges of anti-Semitism. So he was called from where he was staying with family as a young man in Richmond, Virginia, and came up to Philadelphia. He was then approached by the leading woman congregant at Mikveh Israel, who, of course, was Rebecca Gratz, who later went on to found not just the Hebrew Sunday School Society, but a Jewish orphans home, several other charitable organizations. She lived a long life and was very active with the Sanitary Commission that helped wounded Union soldiers during the Civil War. And the Gratzes were the leading family at Mikveh Israel. And Mikveh Israel, although small, today it's a very small congregation, was a powerhouse. It attracted to its membership some of the most learned, created, and dedicated Jews in the country as laymen. And a lot of ideas pop out of Mikveh Israel. And one of those ideas, and I think Rebecca Gratz should get the credit for this, was a regular Saturday morning sermon. Her vantage point was that boys got Jewish instruction because they would get bar mitzvah, but girls didn't. And this is prior to the rise of the confirmation, which early on takes on girls, but it didn't include Hebrew. That women needed instruction in the Jewish religion. So she prevails upon Isaac Leeser to start giving Saturday morning discourses. And the way I discovered this is my master's degree was in the sermons of Isaac Leeser, the first American Jewish full-time preacher. And then later on for my doctorate, I went on to write his biography, which I believe Rabbi Molo has mentioned. And Gratz prevailed upon Leeser to give a weekly message in the synagogue so that the women who were in the balcony could learn about this. And he did. And he valued it very highly to the point where he says it was his greatest achievement. He collects multiple volumes of his sermons, each 500 pages long. And for my master's degree, what I did is I read them, indexed them, analyzed them. I wrote my master's degree. And having read all of these scores and scores of sermons, I can tell you that there wasn't one good one in the whole batch. They were boring. The whole time he only told one story, and that was in the first one. And he just went straight into biblical exposition. But the women didn't mind because they were there for instruction. And in fact, many of them were going to churches on Sunday, not because they wanted to convert, but they didn't have Netflix. And you needed something to do, and you needed some kind of entertainment. And some of the preachers, particularly in Philly, were very, very good. But they quickly ran into a problem in Philadelphia that the service was so long, it was already lunchtime by the time it would get to the sermon. So there was a great debate within the congregation, and they came to a resolution, and the resolution was that the sermon, instead of its traditional place to the Torah reading, would be at the very end of the service, even after the service, so that Leeser in particular would give his sermon, his drash, after Adon Olam, after the closing hymn, which meant that the men left and the women stayed in the balconies and listened to him preach. So the ground floor was probably empty or mostly empty, and the women were upstairs. In the balcony, it was a upper middle class congregation. So when the men went home, there was usually somebody there to serve them lunch, and they were glad not to go. And by the way, that's not an unusual pattern in the history of religion. We know from the diaries of Puritan ministers, they complained that they were mostly preaching to congregations of women, and that the men weren't hanging around. I think they were particularly averse to the sermon. So Leeser introduces the vernacular sermon in English, and he takes great pride in delivering these. And the concept begins to spread in the pre-Civil War period. Jewish newspapers begin to develop around 1843, and very often would rerun the sermons so that people could read them at their own leisure, and they maybe not have to be at the synagogue to hear them. And it became part of the literary experience of the American Jew. A debate then develops as to what language the sermon should be in. During the 19th century, the vast majority of American Jews were from Germany. And almost all the congregations that were formed during this period would invite preachers who spoke in German and not in English, because they couldn't understand the English, and that does not change in general until the 1890s, when the children of these immigrants are American born and they want in English. At the same time, you begin to get the heavy infusion of Jews from East Europe, and their vernacular language is Yiddish. And a fight develops in the Orthodox world as to whether or not sermons should be in Yiddish or in English. It's interesting, in the Reform tradition, the leading Reform rabbi, at least, and one of the dominant rabbis in the country, David Einhorn, in his very last sermon in 1879, his message is the day that Reform Judaism stops communicating in German in the American synagogue, it will cease to be Reform Judaism and it will turn into something else. Orthodoxy had the same issue. And what really distinguishes the rise of modern Orthodoxy as opposed to more traditional Orthodoxy, is the more traditional insisted that the messages remain in Yiddish. And that's no longer the case today in this country. In Israel, it did persist, like in Mea Shearim, as to whether or not they should give talks in Hebrew, because to some extent they viewed spoken Hebrew, as a profanation of Lashon HaKodesh, of the holy language. So the sermon becomes a fixed part of the American synagogue. In general, they were quite lengthy. They moved back into the middle of the sermon. They moved from strict biblical exegesis that you had under Leeser to more general cultural talks, so that by the time you're getting in the 20th century, one of the functions of the rabbi and the sermon as the mechanism was to be a narrator of our times. How are you to explain the pogroms? And why do the Jewish people suffer? Or how do you explain Jewish apathy in America, which was a constant theme? Or what do we do about the women of our synagogues in the 1890s who want to, it's one of the waves of feminism, and it's the beginning of the suffragette movement, and what is their place in the synagogue? And the rabbi becomes a kind of cultural negotiator, translator, navigator of the times. And then a curious thing happens in the Reform movement. Saturday attendance, which was not as bad as some people think it was, mostly attracted women. Most of the men were involved in retail, and Saturday was a big day for retail. So they needed to find a mechanism to get more men in the shul. And there were two experiments The one that ultimately won was Friday night. There had been experimentation on Friday night services as early as the Civil War. Most congregations that have Friday nights really didn't do it until the 1930s. It took a long time for that to settle in. The other alternative was much more controversial, and that was the Sunday lecture, where people would come back to the synagogue not to replace the Sabbath. The Sunday movement in Reform Judaism was not to replace the seventh day with the first day, but instead to shift the largest congregational gathering of the week from Saturday, in which you had a more limited audience, to Sunday. And on Sundays, they had much less service. The services were not real long. And in fact, they shortened down to a few hymns, and the rabbis giving exceptionally long sermons that tended to be, if the preacher was any good, they tended to attract very large crowds. It usually was done once a month on a particular Sunday. So I'm studying with Linda, who I think is online here, Linda Barnes, Rabbi Krauskopf, and on a given Sunday at KI, when he gave a Sunday discourse, the synagogue had a seating capacity of about 2,000, and he would fill it every single time, and it would be about 30% Gentile, because people came to hear preaching. And I would say that was the heyday of American Jewish preaching. And this takes place up to World War I and maybe a little bit beyond. And then it begins to shrink down as Friday night gains increasing favor, and the Sunday school becomes the more dominant force on Sunday mornings. Probably what is left in most synagogues of the Sunday morning lecture is the bagel brunch. And there, instead of competing with prayers and psalms, you're competing with bagels. And there's no question that people left more time for eating than for talking in that particular environment. You also begin to get, in the 20s and the 30s, the broadcasting of sermons, people like Stephen Wise and others. And this is well before World War II, when things get more controversial, so that radio stations would carry great rabbinic speakers like Stephen Wise and others sometime during the week, not Shabbat, in which they would give the equivalent of their Sunday sermon, and it would be nationwide. In the 30s in particular, it became one of the most important defenses against the rise of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism in this country was very, very strong during the 20s and 30s. Father Coughlin of Detroit in particular, and the Sunday address, or whenever day it was, of the radio with the rabbi speaking was the biggest event in the Jewish community on a weekly basis. Families would gather around to listen to Stephen Wise or somebody else respond to Father Coughlin of Detroit, and they had kind of a battle going back and forth across the whole country in the airwaves, and that sustains itself all the way into the World War II period. So you still had the major sermon address, but it's transferred to the radio, and it's transferred outside of the synagogue. Something else happens that is very important to mention. In the immigrant synagogues, where there is and this is particularly true of conservative and modern Orthodox, the sermon was an important mechanism because it helped people hear a learned speech that they could understand in English. And it was important to have English language addresses. The other is Jews, by and large, who were in retail or even earlier than that, were in unions and did not have college educations. And the function of the sermon, just like with Rebecca Gratz asking Leeser to teach the women something about Judaism, the sermon became a vehicle whereby to teach Judaism and culture in general. Headlines. You didn't have 600 networks with 24/7 news, and they were the narrators of our time. And sermons were very, very important in this regard. And the way rabbis got hired, particularly during this period where the country was transitioning from immigrant to native, the tip year, the balance is about 1940. The best way for the best orators in the rabbinic community got the best jobs because that is what was most valued. He could be a schmo, but he could give a good talk and thereby get the job. Uh, and, and this is the way it was up into the suburban period, and Jews begin to move out of the big cities and into the suburbs, and the whole culture of the synagogue changes. First and foremost, they were native born. They were no longer immigrants. They were attuned to American culture and particularly to recreation culture in America, which is growing at the time. And the sermon comes under pressure. And instead of being, in my opinion, the great teaching vehicle, whether it was language or content, it sort of became entertainment. And that trend is reinforced as the entertainment world itself changes, not just from movies, but radio, and it changes, the general culture changes, and it causes the sermon to change and mostly to compress, that it has to be shorter. The president of my synagogue sat in the front row, and those were the days when Casio watches were brand new. And I would begin to speak, and he would put his timer on his watch, and at about 18 minutes, it would start beeping, which was my warning that I was going too long. Whereas an earlier generation, you could have gone 36 minutes without a warning. And in fact, when I got my evaluation, it was always nice guy, leads a good service, but talks too much, that kind of thing. So we still stayed friends. And even more so today, just along that one line of development with the advent of the computer and particularly the cell phone and the creation of modes of communication where you get 54 letters. I don't even know what they're called, these messages, Twitter, stuff like that. And people were only willing to accept little tiny blurbs. At first it was you could go 12 minutes to a commercial and you had to have some humor. And then you had to do something to switch it up if you wanted to go any further. So you throw in another story. Many of the early sermons did another big change, and then I'm going to stop talking. When women came into the pulpit beginning in the 1970s, there was a certain aspect of the sermon done by a male rabbi that was meant to exemplify manliness, even though, and it was an issue among the rabbis, the congregations made the men wear dresses to give their sermons. We wore a robe, and you did not wear typical male clothing. The voice was meant to be a very manly voice. In fact, there was something even called the Princeton method, in which the rabbi developed a deeper, more baritone voice, very profound, full of allusions from Shakespeare and English literature, and it was quote masterful, masterful, and all of that comes under attack from communication, from changing roles of gender in communication, in culture. And then lastly, I would say, because of the work of several scholars, the most familiar of whom would be Martin Buber, there was a discovery of Hasidic lore. This started in the 20s and 30s. Martin Buber puts out a multi-volume collection of Hasidic tales. His purpose was to illustrate his philosophical I thou thesis, which he saw as being central to Hasidic culture, but inadvertently, he also brings a certain format of Jewish content, and something which would have been unimaginable in a Sephardic pulpit or a Reform pulpit, which was German in years before, came the Hasidic tale, which was somehow authentically Jewish. And it was a quick story, sort of like a commercial on television, highly digestible and enjoyable, reinforced by Fiddler on the Roof. The Americanized version of Fiddler on the Roof has nothing to do with the original story by Shalom Aleichem, which doesn't have a pogrom, and they all leave for Palestine at the end. They completely Americanized it, and again, it changed that little piece of the sermon. So that's how we got to today. My contention is the rabbi has a position in the community, both through the pulpit and weekly bulletins, which also, by the way, are beginning to disappear, or almost gone, actually, where there are different ways of getting rabbinic messages, connecting this moment in time to the Torah portion or a holiday, to a great cultural theme. And the rabbis were the narrators of Jewish life, and that is diminishing today, and hence my plea to save the sermon, not the 40-minute sermon, but to save the sermon and the function of the rabbi to serve as an interpreter of Jewish life, and that the best such mechanism, when possible, given attendance, would be the sermon itself. So that was a little bit longer than I intended to go, but I hope there's some questions or reactions on your part, and I invite them.
First of all, thank you, Rabbi, for that incredible lesson. Certainly, a lot to unpack there. And the tradition, I'm happy to report that the tradition of sermons is alive and well at Mainline Reform Temple. You can come to services every week to receive a message from one of our rabbis. So anybody have any questions for Rabbi Sussman?
This is Dave Edmond. I'm at the synagogue, so on the MLRT screen, Nice to see you, Lance.
Hey, David.
Is there a source, Lance, for the great sermons of the week and historically, um, like we have great speeches? What what's the equivalent of the Gettysburg Address in sermons?
Like I said earlier, you have to turn to Mark Saperstein,
Mark Saperstein, okay.
and he does have an anthology of historical sermons. And there were some great moments. There were disputations in Portugal in the 15th century and things like that. None of them as short as the Gettysburg Address, I assure you. None of them are under 300 words. Um, and we've also had a small transition, I should mention, to the Devar Torah. And even kids give the Devar Torah before reading for their bar mitzvah, but they're usually under 2 minutes. So as a literary genre today, it is diminished. But there are great sermons of the past. Uh, there were a couple sermons in American history that really caught the attention of the general public. It's interesting, for example, the day after the Battle of Gettysburg was the 17th of Tammuz, which is a fast day. And the rabbi of Mikveh Israel, Sabbato Moray, gave a talk on July the 4th of 1863. It was during the week, so the churches weren't open, and some members of the Union League went to hear him preach. And you had that kind of interfaith cooperation. And he gave his talk about the Battle of Gettysburg by saying the following: 77 years ago, our forefathers brought forth on this nation, and the members of the Union League loved it so much that they ran to the telegram office and sent it to Abraham Lincoln in the White House. So it is not a proven fact, just because they happen to be identical words, that a rabbinic sermon had that kind of impact. And I would say the other one was Joachim Prince, who was the rabbi of big synagogue in Newark, which he had a terrible problem because he had a lot of Jewish mafia in his synagogue, was one of the warm-up acts for Martin Luther King. This is on tape, and his autobiography has been published by Michael Meyer of Cincinnati, in which he gave a talk on the steps of the Washington Memorial. And I know that's particularly interesting part of American history to you, David, in which he said, the greatest enemy we have in the combating of evil is not other evil, but silence. And he said he spoke as the former rabbi of Berlin. And what he learned was that when the times get tough and there's persecution and you're silent and what later becomes known as a bystander, you're doing an awful lot of damage. And since you can't hear Sabbato Moray, you can go online and look up Joachim Prince, Prinz speeches at the Washington Day in the I Have a Dream speech. It was just prior to that. And it is from top to, it's not very long, from top to bottom. It is a truly prophetic rabbinic address.
Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Lance.
And just in case anybody would like to look more into that, Mark Saperstein's book, his latest volume is Jewish Preaching in Times of War, 1800 to 2001, which was published in 2012. And it's a study of how Jewish sermons responded to moments of war and crisis.
Yeah, it's really interesting. For example, in the Reform movement, most Reform Jews were German, and between 1914 and 1917, they remained pro-German, and then the United States goes to war against Germany, and that's the kind of topic that he looks at. And a sermon plays a big role in public opinion in making transitions like that.
Any other questions for Rabbi Sussman? I think we covered a lot of ground today for sure.
So,
All right,
you
well,
know, everybody knows the old joke, and then I'll be glad to be quiet about the rabbi and the cantor and the president of the congregation who on an airplane that's hijacked, and the terrorist says, "I'll give you each one wish," and the cantor says, "I want to sing all the great music of the high holidays before I go." And the rabbi says, "I want to preach all my great sermons before I go." And the president of the synagogue says, "Shoot me first."
I mean, okay. Sneak in a question here at the last minute. You are muted though.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. I have a question about optimum length for a sermon. Most people find that they're too long. And for today's flighty attention spans, and what do you consider um, an appropriate length that has enough time for content and reflection on the audience, and yet is not too long?
Right. It's an important question. And go back to the Gettysburg Address, that when Lincoln gave it, uh, the speech before his was 3 hours long. Okay. Everybody criticized Lincoln for having failed his duty to give a full length talk. So cultural standards are constantly changing. I would say if you went back 150 years, the average sermon was between 45 minutes to an hour. Because of television and other electronic communication, commercials, etc., it has shrunk. In some traditions, the amount of time allotted to a sermon today is zero. I got into a spat with the president of the Reconstructionist College here in Philly. The newspaper wanted to run a story as to how do rabbis prepare sermons for the high holy days, and I gave my shtick, and his answer was, "We don't give sermons because people don't want to hear them." And I went crazy. I just completely blew a fuse over that one, which brings us to the present moment. Uh, I think if it's a good talk, Um, and depend 12 minutes is short and 18 minutes is kind of your boundary. What I did, because I like to give talks like this, is I would skip the sermon at KI, uh, dismiss to the Onyx Shabbat, and then give an adult education program on Friday night where I could speak for 45 minutes. But if you came to say Kaddish or you had children on board or something like that, you could leave. And it was, for my time full time in the pulpit, that was a happy compromise. But the short answer, Kay, to your question is 12 is on the short side, and 18 is probably where they're beginning to look at their Apple Watches. What do you think?
Well, first of all, our synagogue has stopped having Onyx Shabbats. It's 6:30 to 7:45, and it's out the door. So the sermon would have to be incorporated within the
Within the
service.
sermon, right? And I've found during COVID, which is a big game changer, and it's another discussion, that I greatly shortened my sermons down to about 5, 6 minutes, because And then when we came back, I had to slowly rebuild toward that 12-minute minimum mark. I actually had a few requests to give longer talks. So it depends, is it a 1 hour service? I know in the Orthodox community, there's a different pressure that they want a shorter sermon today because they expect the rabbi to teach a lesson, like a Talmud lesson, for a lengthy amount of time on Shabbat afternoon for the people who can't study all week. And they'd rather the effort go into that than into giving a drash on a Saturday or a Friday. Fridays are reform. Uh, um, and that's where you have your audiences on Friday night. And I think part of the assumption is people have a little bit more time. Very scrambled by COVID. And different synagogues um, handle it very years ago when Liz and I first got married. Her home synagogue was in Rye, New York, and services didn't even begin until 8:30 because almost all the men were commuters from Manhattan, and the service would start at 8:30, and the rabbi would still speak for at least a half an hour because they were still of the mode there that the rabbi was the narrator or teacher of the community, even though it was 9:30 and services weren't even getting to the Oneg Shabbat to 10 o'clock. And that was specific to a region. So it's a little hard to answer your question, but the short version overall is 12 to 18. Eric, do you have anything to say about mainline culture on that?
Yeah, I would say, that's right in the sweet spot
Yeah.
of where we are as well.
What about on the high holidays?
Holidays, particularly Yom Kippur, I think you have a little more freedom to go 20 to even 30 minutes if you're good. If you're good, because you have nowhere else. Your next event is lunch after services on Rosh Hashanah and nothing at all on Yom Kippur. I will confess now that I'm on pension and I don't have to go to board meetings. I generally went too long. As you can tell, I like to talk. And I also had a double career in terms of my own story, where I was also simultaneously a university professor. I taught on Tuesdays and Thursdays, so I was used to giving 90-minute lectures, and the kids had to take it because they were paying for it and they had exams. And quote, I got it out of my system so that I had given two 90-minute talks. By the time I got to synagogue, I was fine with a 15-minute talk. But psychologically, I really needed to empty myself of all of that because you sit around and you think about this stuff and you want to share it, but you have to be fair to the people in front of you. It might be an older crowd, it might be an exhausted crowd, it might be a crowd, and you get to children's services, you don't even give a sermon, you tell a story. And that's about 5 minutes long because you're dealing with little kids and a different attention span.
Well, isn't adult attention span tremendously shortened in
Yes.
our era?
Yeah. Television and cell phones. Television. So the sermon is under crushing pressure at this point to get some kind of message in. And I've noticed in some synagogues, in lieu of a sermon at the center of the service where it fits structurally, according to the little prompts, is the word they use in schools today, before Mithamocha or before Hashkivenu, and you get a little rabbinic message and a little Torah in pieces sprinkled across the service instead of one sermon in the middle. So it's another technique where the rabbis are kind of pushing back and saying, we got to talk, we got to teach. That's our job. That's why we were brought here, but not to violate some time code where you really don't want people to start looking at their watches, if they even have a watch, look at their cell phones. And they're looking at their cell phones because their faces turn blue in the sanctuary. So,
well, I want to thank you, Rabbi Sussman, for joining us today. We have gone over our time for today, but what a way to kick off your residency with us. I'm going to share my screen briefly just so everybody can see this lovely picture of Rabbi Sussman, but also our upcoming classes. So we'll be right back here on Zoom next Thursday for another exciting topic, Sink or Swim, the future of Reform Judaism. Certainly a timely discussion given all the recent changes. And then the Thursday after that, we'll have the special relationship between American Jews and President Teddy Roosevelt. So lots of exciting things coming up here. And we'll look forward to more next week. So thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Thank you, Rabbi Sussman. And
my pleasure. Thanks.
next time. Take care, everybody.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.